Hello, my name is Rob Garner. I'm a computer programming instructor, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to use vectors in C++. First, we'll open up Visual Studio, File, New, Project. We're going to create a C++ empty project and call it Vector Demo. I'm going to store it on the desktop. I'm going to right-click my project, go to Properties, go to Linker, System, and set my subsystem to Console so that when I run my program, it will keep the console open until I close it. I'm going to add a new item. A CPP file which I will call Vector Demo. I'm going to add some standard things that we need for a C++ program to work by including IOStream. So we can do input and output on the console, and then I'm going to add I'm going to use namespace standard, some comments, and then my main method, which is the first method which the operating system will call when it runs my program, and I'll return 0 to the operating system to let it know that everything ran okay. One of the things you can do if you do this a lot is you can actually move that to your toolbox. And from then on, if you want to, you can just drag it from the toolbox onto your sheet to get it started. So, what we're going to do with this program is we're going to declare some variables. We're going to start a do while loop, get some user input, we're going to validate the input with an if then statement, and if it's not empty we'll add it to a vector. Then we're going to loop back if input is not an empty string, and then at the end we'll loop through the vector and display it. So what I'm going to do is use the empty string as my indicator that the user's done providing input. I often like programming this way. I'll write out what I want to do in comments. This means that my code is already commented, and it also lays out how I'm going to do the program. Once I have that, I won't code everything all at once. Typically, I'll do some things that I'll try to do some of the trivial parts of the program first. So I know I'm going to need a string to get user input, and then I'm going to declare a vector. So to declare a vector, we use the vector type, and we can see it's not recognizing it. So I also need to include vector up above. So I need the vector library in order to do things with vectors, and then I can use, then the vector class starts showing up in IntelliSense. So when we use a vector, what we do is we declare our variable as a vector, and within greater than less than signs we place the type of item we want in our vector. And a vector is basically a list of items. In this case, this vector is a list of strings. And so I'm going to call it text lines, because what we're going to do is we're going to input lines of text from the user, and then we're going to display it. So this is a vector of text lines. So this is a vector of strings which correspond to text lines that the user inputs. So then I'll start my do loop, and I see that it ends down here. And since I know that I'm going to input user text, my condition is going to be while user text does not equal. So I'll keep looping through until the user enters an empty line. And to get that user input, I'll ask the user to please enter a line of text. And we can see that it's not recognizing getLine, so we need to also include the string library. And so now I have code that gets a line of text. And before I code anything else, this is actually a functional piece of code at this point, so I'm going to test it. I hit Control F5, let it compile, and I'll just try to see if I'm actually working. And so I validated that I'm getting input. I'm validating that my loop is working, and then I'm going to just hit enter to see if it brings in the empty string and terminates, and it does. So at this point I know that my basic functionality works, and I don't have to worry about that anymore. If I coded it all at once, I would have to worry about every single piece of the code. I much prefer to code a little piece and then test it. Add a little bit more, test it, add a little bit more, and test it. So the next thing we want to do is I look at my code and say, well, what's actually put that in the wrong spot. What's a logical thing to do next? Well, I could try to loop through a vector display, but the vector is really empty. So the next logical thing is to fill this vector. And it says if input is not empty string, then add it to the vector. So I'll need an if-then statement. And I'm going to check to make sure that it's not this empty string. And if it's not the empty string, then I'm going to add that line of text to my text lines vector. And in order to do that, the vector class has a number of methods associated with it. And so what we've done is we have text lines, which is declared as a vector. A vector is all types that are classes, in which vector is a class. If I put the dot operator after the name of a variable declared as that type, I can see that there's a list that comes up of items that are associated with text lines, and these are variables and functions which are associated with those text lines. We'll learn with object-oriented programming later, we call them actually properties and methods. But for now, just think of them as variables that are associated with text lines, because text line is a vector. And since text line is a vector, one of the things that it has is the pushback function right here. And so if you go on to MSDN website and look up pushback vector, it will tell you a lot, but you can also select it and hover over it, and you can see it tells you a little bit about it. It tells me that it's public void. That it takes a vector and so in order to use this, I'm going to click pushback, and then when I hit my first parentheses, I'll actually get the overloads. And if I click up and down on these overloads, I can see that the format is void. It doesn't return anything. And that it takes one parameter. And in fact, what it does is it takes a string, because I specified string up here in my vector. And so the string I'm going to use is user text. So my user input is string. I'm going to use the pushback function to add this string to text lines, which is a vector, and it's a vector of strings, so this pushback function will actually put this string onto this list of strings. So basically, pushback just adds user text to text lines, and then I'll loop back. So again, I can test this functionality. I'll run it, and I'll just start entering lines, and it appears to be inputting lines. I don't know if the vector is loaded with anything at this point in time, but it seems like it works. I can actually try to see if it's working also by putting a breakpoint, going to debug, and start in debugging mode. And if I run in debugging mode, I can see that I have user text and text lines are defined. And interestingly, we can see that user text right now, there's nothing defined in it. Text line size is 0, so my vector has no elements in it. And we'll start running. So I'll go to debug and step over, and by clicking F10 I go from line to line. So here we're on the next line. We see that our variables are declared its user text is now an empty string. Step over again. Keep stepping over until we get please enter the lines of text shows up. I'll then input my line of text and press enter. And then what we notice is that user text becomes line 1, and our text lines still has nothing, the size is 0. In addition to using the menu for debug, you can also use the buttons that are located up here. So I'm going to step over again. So the if is completed. The line I input was not empty, so it continues on into the body of the if statement. And now it puts user text, and we see that now text lines is size of 1, so it has 1 element on it. And we can see here this 0 represents the first element that's on our vector, and it's got line 1 in it. My while goes back up because user text is not empty, an empty string. Asks for another line of text. Put another line in, hit enter, and we see that user text equals another line. That's going to pass this condition, so we're going to run the pushback, and we now see that our text lines has 2 elements in it, and if we click the plus we can see that element 1 is line 1 and element 2 is another line. So you can see that it's collecting strings and adding them to the vector, and since we declared vector as a vector of strings, it will do that. You could also create a vector of integers, you could create a vector of doubles. Whatever you specified will be what it will accumulate into this vector. So we'll do another one, and I'll put and yet another line, and we see that user text gets assigned that value. When we execute the if text line, it gets added to text lines, and so on and so forth. If I continue, it'll keep running the program, and if I hit enter, it'll finish up. So that's how this vector is accumulating our users' inputs and placing them into a list. So we have pretty good confidence now that we're getting values into text lines. And the next thing we want to do is actually display the result back to the user. So we're going to give them a header line up here just so that they know what we're displaying for them below. And we're going to use a for loop. So we're going to initialize our for loop with an integer. We're going to set it initially to 0. Remember, when we went through the debug, we saw that the first element was actually 0, not 1. And most things in C++ are 0 based if they're in lists. So they start with element 0, not element 1. And we're going to go from 0 till I is less than, and we need to know how many elements are inside of our vector. Well, it turns out that the vector class actually has a method associated with it which we can use. So I'm going to hit the dot operator next to my vector, and if I didn't know, I could actually just kind of search through here and see, is there anything useful that will tell me what the size of this thing is. Oh, look, there's a size, and it looks like it's a method. You can see here that there's parentheses. So I'm going to click size, and it looks like it's just the empty parameter string. So we open and close those parentheses. And so we're going to go to I is less than size. And the reason why we go less than size is because it's zero based, the actual last index will be one less than the actual size. So if we have 10 elements in our vector, then the last one we want to, then they will be numbered from 0 to 9, not from 0 to 10. So rather than using less than or equals here, we use just less than. And then I'm going to just increment one by one. We could also, by the way, do this equals I plus 1. That's legal. We could also say I plus equals 1, but generally speaking, the most succinct way of doing it is just plus plus I. And what we want to do is display those text lines to the user. So once again, we have another question: is how do I display the I element at index I for the text lines? Well, again, I'm going to hit the dot operator and see if there's something useful. And they have this at function. And if I didn't know what that was, I could go look up online and see what it is. So let's go look at Google. And I'm going to put MSDN for Microsoft Developer Network and vector class. And at method, or you could just put vector class. And I'm going to see here that there's a number of inputs, and I could read through them, and the one that I found the most useful is this one. And if you look at this list, we see that Microsoft has provided us documentation on this vector class, and if we look through it, we can see all of the functions, including this at one, defined. And if I click on at, it tells me returns a reference to the element at a specified location. It gives me kind of a prototype definition of it. It tells me a little bit about it, and then it gives me an example. So I can see here's that pushback function we use to put two elements on the vector, and here it's using the at function in order to get access to it. And I see I'm passing it a number, which is presumably the element that I want to display. So down here I can use the at function, and I'm going to pass it my index I that I'm looping through, so that I can go through each of these indexes from 0 to the number of elements in the text lines and display them all. So let's see if this works. I'm going to hit Control F5, click yes. So I put in a few lines of text. I hit enter to end, and it displays all my lines of text. Of course, they're all on one line. That's not very convenient. So I'm going to add an end line here to put a carriage return at the end. The vector only stores strings. It doesn't store the carriage return at the end, because when we hit the carriage return, what went into user text was just the text from the beginning to the end, not including the carriage return. So we have to provide that ourselves. We'll try it again. And we see that yes, we are getting our lines back out of that vector by using the at function. This completes my demonstration of the vector class. The key points to remember is declare your vector using the vector keyword, and within the less than and greater than signs put in the type of elements that you want to put in your vector, whether it's a string or double or an integer. Use the pushback method to put elements on there. Make sure that the element that you're putting into the parameter for pushback is actually of the same type as you defined the vector as. And then you can use the at method to retrieve elements, passing it an index, which is an integer. And you can use the size operator to find out the size of your vector so that you can loop through it and not exceed the number of elements that you have in that vector. Thank you.